Hey everyone, I'm Max and I'll be presenting our paper to you on a threat-based cybersecurity risk assessment approach addressing SME needs. Our group is a part of the Geiger EU Horizon 2020 project, and that is who I'm presenting on behalf of. So, what do you see here? This is a rock climber, Alex Honnold is his name, and apparently he's never heard of the concept of countermeasures because he's climbing a big, massive rock without any support, without any ropes, without any gear. So that's quite a dangerous activity that he's taking part in. And the big question, of course, is how can we get Alex to behave a bit more safely, and how can we motivate him in future to start using protective gear? So how do we convince someone that countermeasures are necessary to start wearing a helmet, for example? Well, usually what we do is we start reasoning about what could happen if you don't use those countermeasures. So the threats that are present if you don't use such countermeasures. In this case, well, you may fall down and you may hurt yourself. You may even end up in an even worse situation than just a bit of pain. And this motivation from a source of threats is something we see a lot in cybersecurity as well. So here you see an example from the EU Cybersecurity Act, where the EU is reasoning increased digitization and connectivity increase cybersecurity risk, thus making society as a whole more vulnerable to cyber threats. And this is how the reasoning goes, and it comes back a couple of times in this act actually, and it comes back a lot in cybersecurity literature in general. That's why we ask, does it sound familiar? Well, it should sound familiar. This is sort of the type of reasoning we see a lot, using threats as a motivation for why we are writing what we're writing, why we are advising what we are advising. And it makes sense to use threats in motivation. Protection motivation theory and self-determination theory both posit that a cybersecurity risk assessment solution is more likely to motivate user action if the user is convinced of risk associated with threats and their ability to deal with threats. So those two things combined, being convinced of the risk, being convinced of your ability to deal with it. In PMT, we see this coming back in threat and coping appraisal as those two topics. In STT, we have core psychological needs of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. For those, I will explain a bit more later on, so remember these for later. So SMEs are the group that we are interested in, small and medium-sized enterprises, and they need to be motivated more than anybody, you could argue. So especially the least digitally mature SMEs have very little cybersecurity knowledge and resources, and their motivation is therefore quite low to improve their cybersecurity. So it makes sense to use these insights from PMT and STT to motivate SMEs, to put threats centrally in your approach and start motivating SMEs to take action. But many cybersecurity risk assessment approaches are not, in fact, threat-based, and those that are often do not focus on SMEs, so they are the target group we're focusing on, and it's a group in dire need of motivation in cybersecurity solutions. So there is a gap there, clearly. So how can we create a cybersecurity risk assessment approach for SMEs that promotes user motivation? So you should at this point know what the answer to that is. We use threats, of course. That's exactly what we do in our paper and how we explain our approach. We use expert insights, which you see here in this figure as a curator inputting settings, which are essentially those insights captured in data. We use incident data from the outside world, from the real world, coming from certs, as input in our algorithm, and we use user data itself, obviously, to provide a dynamic solution catered specifically to a specific user. And all of this data is aggregated and collected into our algorithm, which outputs results which are user specific, but most importantly, again, they're threat-based. They're threat-based, and we are driving our motivation of SME users in that sense by basing ourselves on threats. So remember these needs, these psychological needs I was referring to earlier: autonomy, competence, relatedness. Here are their definitions, STT definitions: autonomy, desire to engage in activities with willingness and a freedom of choice, very much close to what you would probably find in a dictionary definition for these terms. competence, desire to interact effectively with the environment for developing wanted outcomes and preventing undesired events, and relatedness, a sense of belongingness and connectedness to others or a social environment. So autonomy, competence, relatedness, all important properties, psychological needs that are sort of a prerequisite for behavioral intent to take action. We need to motivate these SMEs to take action. These are the factors that are important. So this is also what we took into account when we designed our solution, and is what you see when you look at our user interface, our screens that we have in our approach. So here you see an example screen of a scan result and a scan in progress, which shows sort of the user top threats. They have an autonomy. Autonomy is motivated in the sense of showing threats that are relevant to the user, and they have a choice to see, where am I going to take action? Am I going to improve phishing? Am I going to improve malware? It's up to me. It's my choice. And competence is motivated as well, because we have recognizable concepts in phishing, malware, common threats that we explain to the user clearly. And we use colors and all these things to have a recognizable context for the user to motivate a feeling of competence. Pairing and sharing is an important part of our solution. Users use devices, and these should be paired to the user, and also data of the user is shared or allowed to be shared with their supervisors, for example. In an SME, that's a structure you encounter a lot. Someone has supervisors, and they may want to share their scores with their supervisors. In everything, we leave the user with the choice. They can deny supervision. In this image, Colin Sutherland was denied supervision, and that's a choice for the user, meaning they have some autonomy. When threats have been assessed and we want to work towards improvement, suggesting countermeasures, specifically giving specific recommendations, a lot of these SCT needs are addressed in this part of our solution, actually. Autonomy, in the sense that, again, users are allowed to choose whatever they want to do. We're not forcing them to do certain things. It's their choice to do this. Feeling of competence, in that they can always get help. We also indicate that certain recommendations may be difficult to enact, so they don't feel uncomfortable in not being able to implement them by themselves, and are comfortable in asking for help. And relatedness is sort of behind the scenes here. We have people behind this get help button, defenders that are there to help the user, and that the user hopefully at some point knows and feels a connection with, which is how we sort of promote this feeling of relatedness, by having actual people help them to implement the recommendations we suggest. So is this threat-based approach, our threat-based approaches in general, the holy grail? Probably not, and probably more than anything, they're very useful for SMEs as well. SMEs are looking to be, or should be motivated. Larger enterprises often are already motivated. They want to conform to standards, regulations, and they have different needs from a cybersecurity risk assessment solution. For SMEs, we really need to guide them. We need to motivate them. Using a threat-based approach there makes a lot of sense, and also having a human aspect in there to help them with that process. So that's what you sort of see here on this left image. Larger enterprises need more guarantees. They need, when they have this risk assessment solution, they need to be guaranteed that their solution, when they use it, really ensures that they satisfy regulations, standards, and things like this, which is sort of what this rope, for example, on the right, would provide, a guarantee that something really protects against all risks. With SMEs, that's less of a focus, and perhaps that's also something inherent in threat-based approaches, that's not going to always show up, those absolute guarantees. Lots of future challenges obviously remain for us, and in general, accuracy versus complexity trade-off. We need more data to be more accurate in our solution, but we don't want a solution that is too complex for users to really understand. And that's a trade-off that's really hard to make. We also are still struggling how to exactly communicate certain uncertainties to the user if they do not provide enough data for our risk assessment. Of course, there are uncertainties in this risk assessment, so you should probably communicate this to users, but how, and how do you still then satisfy those STT needs? And lastly, we want to create a comfortable environment for information sharing, of course, so that we have this data that we need so badly, But we also need to respect privacy of users, and that's a trade-off that's always going to be hard to make. So lots of challenges remain, but for now at least, thank you a lot for listening, and I hope to see you soon.